January 14th, 1952, 11:17 at night. A brownstone on 133rd Street in Harlem. The city breathed hard against winter, but inside, the air was cold. A single steel click, a muzzle pressed to flesh. Then one thunderous report, that sound sharp, final, echoing off brick changed history. A bodyguard pulled the trigger at point-blank range, and for the first time in years, nobody in Harlem dared look away. This is the story of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson and the shot that didn't just kill a man, but fractured an empire. New York, 1930s and 40s. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was a crucible. Black ambition, white disdain, immigrant survival. Music seeped out of smoky clubs. Money changed hands in dark alleys and back rooms. And in the middle of it all walked a man in a tailored suit, hat tilted, eyes unreadable. His name was Bumpy Johnson. He was a strategist first, a thinker, a man who understood that power was not just muscle, it was patience, observation, leverage. He never rushed, he listened, he let others make the first mistake. In the silence between words, he heard fortunes won and lost. Johnson understood the real currency of power. Information, territory, yes, money, yes, but respect, fear entwined with admiration, that was the true prize. And he collected it not by brute force, but by inevitability. When he spoke, men weighed his words like ledgers. When he walked into a room, the room measured its own worth. Harlem in those decades was pressure and motion. Rents soared, jobs were scarce. The war had taken fathers and left ambition in their place. Gangs were not aberrations, they were answers to voids left by a society that had promised more than it delivered. On Lenox Avenue, the clubs pulsed with life. But just a block over, alliances formed and dissolved in the shadows. Every man had an angle, every man had a price, and every man watched Bumpy Johnson like a storm advancing slow, sure, and all-consuming. This was a game of survival woven into a tapestry of economics, law, and unspoken rules. Territory wasn't just turf, it was identity. Money wasn't just cash, it was freedom. And respect wasn't just admiration, it was survival. No story of power survives without adversaries. And Johnson's foes were neither foolish nor brutish. They were structured, calculated, they moved in cells, networks, and veins that pulsed with deadly precision. The mafia had its reach. The numbers racket brimmed with cold logic and colder ambition. Rival crews stitched alliances with politicians, police, and businessmen, each believing they could outmaneuver Harlem's philosopher king. They respected Johnson, they feared him, but they misjudged the depth of his resolve and the breadth of his patience. One adversary in particular stood apart, a syndicate fixer named Angelo Marciano, a man with Italian connections and a mind like a chess master. Where others saw blood and territory, Marciano saw leverage. He could buy loyalty, he could manipulate fear, and he believed he could force Johnson's hand. In whispered meetings in downtown speakeasies, Marciano's name was spoken with a mix of awe and disdain. He was calm in negotiation and ruthless in execution. His men were disciplined, his plans were layered, and he believed that one well-placed betrayal could topple even Johnson's towering reputation. The plan was refined with surgical precision. Rumors would be the blade's edge, misplaced hope the bait. Marciano's lieutenants fed whispers into Harlem's undercurrent, quiet suggestions that Johnson had lost his instincts, that the law was closing in, that allies were turning. These murmurs spread faster than truth. Inside the brownstone on 133rd Street, Johnson sat at a walnut table. The room glowed under a single lamp. Papers lay scattered, ledgers, schedules, coded notes. His bodyguard, a stoic man named Thomas Knuckles Malone, straightened the creases in his jacket. His eyes were steady. No fear, just readiness. Johnson didn't speak. He barely needed to. He watched a single ash curl from a cigarette, rise, and disappear into darkness. Silence clung to that room like fog. Time stretched. They were waiting for a meeting with Marciano's envoy, a supposed peace negotiation, a sharing of territory that Marciano claimed served them both. Johnson agreed to meet, but not out of trust, out of convenience. He saw a pattern in Marciano's movements, and he knew a trap when one was set before him. Knuckles stood by the window, eyes tracking every shadow cast by the street lamp. A soft thump outside, the sound of footsteps. Another, then silence. The door opened. 3 men entered, hands visible, intent clear. The room froze. The tallest drew first, a sleek, automatic, cold metal glint. A demand, down on the floor. Bumpy stepped forward, hands loose at his sides, calm, unshaken, his eyes locked with the intruders. Time seemed to slow. Johnson spoke, his voice measured. "You came a long way for this," he said. "No fear, no plea, just fact." But the gunman didn't lower his weapon. Betrayal hovered in the air, thick as smoke. Knuckles moved then, not as an instinct but as an inevitable judgment. A single step, a steel whisper of movement, a muzzle pressed against flesh, and then the thunderous report. One shot. It echoed not only in that room, but through every dark corner of Harlem's spine. The gunman fell. The other two froze, uncertainty gripping their shoulders like iron chains. Knuckles lowered the smoking weapon. His breath was calm, deliberate. One shot. No frenzy, no spectacle. A single, controlled moment. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted. What was meant to be a trap became its own undoing. Marciano's men were trained to strike, but not to lose. They were organizers of calculated violence, but they were not prepared for a strategist who could see betrayal coming like a storm on the horizon. Johnson stepped closer to the fallen man. He didn't gloat, he didn't threaten, he simply observed. The room was quiet again. Only the distant hum of Harlem nights persisted. The remaining envoys dropped their weapons not out of surrender, but out of recognition. The calculated calm of Johnson and the precise action of his bodyguard had already rewritten the script of that night. Word travels in shadows and in whispers. In Harlem, that single report ricocheted through basements, barbershops, and backseat deals. By dawn, every hustler, every fixer, every muscle man knew Bumpy Johnson was not to be trifled with. He had seen the trap. He had walked knowingly into its maw, and he had walked out with the advantage. Across the underworld, figures once confident in their strategies paused. Plans were reconsidered, alliances re-examined. The rules had shifted. Johnson's reputation was no longer built on whispers of threat, but on the undeniable testament of one precise shot. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks in silence before it acts. In that quiet before the trigger, Johnson demonstrated his calculus. Observe, anticipate, then act with unerring resolve. History blurs facts with legend. Some accounts claim that Marciano's men never intended to kill that, they merely wished to show dominance. Others assert that the bullet was meant for Johnson himself, until Knuckles intervened. The truth lies between whispers, but what cannot be denied is the sound, the single explosive declaration that echoed through Harlem on that cold January night. Reporters years later attempted to trace the events, to map motives, to decode alliances. Some spoke of divine timing, others chalked it up to sheer instinct, but those who lived the streets knew better. Johnson's mind was a landscape of probabilities. He saw not just the present, but the patterns that birthed the future. And on that night, his gaze never wavered. Harlem changed after that winter. A new respect spread through the speakeasies and roadhouses. A new caution hovered in the eyes of Marciano's affiliates. And in the quiet corners of shadowy rooms, men repeated the story not as gossip, but as doctrine. A bodyguard pulled the trigger at point-blank range, but the shot did more than end a life. It redefined the measure of power. It taught that precision outlives brutality, that strategy survives chaos, that silence can be louder than a scream. Johnson remained. His legend grew not through countless battles, but through undeniable moments like this moment, where he saw the end before the beginning. What is legend? It is the shape of truth, sharpened by retelling. Rumors swirl. Some say Johnson orchestrated the entire meeting to unmask a double cross. Others claim that the bullet itself bore a message, that it was meant as a warning, not just to Marciano, but to every would-be tyrant ever tempted to think they held all the cards. We may never know every facet of that night, but we know the sound, we know its echo, and we know that in the stillness after it faded, a new order emerged. Power is not taken, it is recognized, and once recognized, it cannot be unseen. In the end, the legend of Bumpy Johnson teaches a single truth. It is not the gun that decides fate, but the mind that wields it. The softest whisper can carry the greatest threat when spoken by a man who has already seen the outcome. January 14th, 1952, 11:17 at night. One shot, one shift of history. Remember the sound. If you wish to walk deeper into the shadows of history, to understand how legends are etched into the cracks of our cities, then listen closely. For every echo tells a story, and every story holds its own truth. Subscribe to follow the legends behind the legends.